I stood at the edge of the Eternal Garden's grand hall, where crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors, their gleam sharp enough to cut. The air was thick with the scent of roses and champagne, a perfume of wealth that clung to the tailored suits and glittering gowns of the guests. My daughter Vivian's wedding was a spectacle, a stage set for dreams, or as I'd soon learn, for betrayals cloaked in velvet. I'm Gus Reyes, a man of oil-stained hands and a past buried deeper than most would dare to dig. At 58, I thought I'd seen every shadow life could throw. But tonight the darkness wore a smile. The ceremony had unfolded like a well-rehearsed play, Vivian radiant in her mother's altered lace gown, her eyes bright with hope. Jasper, her groom, all polished charm and calculated glances, and me, the quiet father in a navy suit, frayed at the seams but pressed with care. I'd walked her down the aisle, my chest tight with pride, and something heavier, a whisper of unease I couldn't name. The officiant's words had faded into a hum, drowned by the memory of my late wife, Maria, whose ring hung warm against my chest, a talisman of promises kept. I told myself it was just nerves. Weddings do that to fathers. But the air felt wrong, like the stillness before a storm breaks. The reception began, and I found my place at table 12, tucked in a corner far from the head table where Vivian and Jasper basked in the glow of their new vows. The placement wasn't accidental. I'd seen Jasper's eyes earlier, the way they slid over me like I was a smudge on his perfect world. A simple man, he'd called me once, his voice dripping with the kind of pity that cuts deeper than scorn. I'm a mechanic, a veteran, a man who built a life from wrenches and resolve. Simple maybe. Weak never. I sipped my water, watching the room. Guests laughed, their voices tinkling like the crystal they held. Waiters glided silently, trays balanced with flutes of champagne that caught the chandelier light like tiny stars. Vivian was at the center of it all, her smile fragile but fierce, as if she were holding something together by sheer will. Jasper leaned close to her, whispering, his hand possessive on her arm. I shifted in my seat, the unease coiling tighter in my gut. Something was off, something beyond the usual tension of a wedding day. Then it happened. A guest at a nearby table, an older man with a kind smile, waved me over. "Gus, come tell us about Vivian's first bike ride?" He called, his voice warm with nostalgia. I smiled, faintly grateful for the distraction. I rose my hand, reaching for the chair to slide it back under the table, a habit of order from years in the garage. My fingers brushed the wood, and then nothing. The chair vanished, yanked away with a force that sent me staggering. Time slowed the world, tilting as my knees buckled. My body hit the polished marble with a crack that echoed like a gunshot, silencing the room. Pain shot through my shoulder, sharp and hot, but it was nothing compared to the fire that erupted in my chest as laughter spilled from the tables. Not all laughed. Some gasped, some froze, but the sound was a blade slicing through the fragile dignity I'd carried into this place. I lay there for a heartbeat, the cold marble against my cheek, my breath shallow. Above me, Jasper stood, his hands still on the chair, his lips curled in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oops," he said, his voice loud enough to carry, soft enough to feign innocence. "Looks like someone's a bit unsteady." Age catches us all, doesn't it, Mr. Reyes? The room held its breath, waiting for my response. I didn't shout or curse. I didn't move. I looked up at him, my eyes steady, and saw something flicker in his gaze, something darker than mockery, something deliberate. This wasn't a prank. It was a message. "Your place is on the floor," he murmured low enough that only those closest could hear his words, sharp as a dagger's edge. I felt the weight of every eye in the room, the whispers already forming, the judgments taking shape. But I also felt something else, a spark deep and buried, the kind that had carried me through desert nights and gunfire years ago. Vivian's cry cut through the haze. "Dad!" Her voice was raw, panicked as she rushed toward me, her bouquet abandoned petals scattering like snow across the aisle. She knelt beside me, her hands trembling on my arm. "Are you okay?" Her eyes were wide, a storm of love and shame swirling within them. I squeezed her hand, my voice calm despite the ache in my bones. "I'm fine, Princess." But she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her gaze snapped to Jasper, and for the first time I saw a crack in the dream she'd built around him. I pushed myself up slowly, deliberately, the way a man rises when he knows the world is watching. My shoulder burned, but I stood tall, brushing off my jacket, with a steadiness that felt like defiance. The laughter died, replaced by awkward coughs and shifting chairs. Guests looked away, their faces flushed, not with amusement now, but with the shame of having laughed at cruelty, disguised as humor. Jasper stood unmoved, his smile unwavering as if he'd won some silent battle. He leaned toward his table, whispering something to the guests there, his eyes never leaving mine. The venom in his gaze was clear now, a challenge I hadn't fully understood until this moment. And then the boots. Not the polished clicks of dress shoes, but the heavy, deliberate thud of boots crossing the marble floor. The sound was out of place in this palace of glass, and light a rhythm that carried the weight of a different world. The crowd turned, their murmurs fading. At the entrance stood a man in his 60s. His hair grayed at the temples, his suit fine but slightly askew as if he'd arrived in a hurry. His shoulders were squared, his posture that of a soldier, though he wore no uniform now. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the frozen guests. Vivian's trembling form, Jasper's smug stance. Then they landed on me. His face drained of color, his lips parting, as if he'd seen a ghost rise from the marble. "Sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet heavy enough to still the room. "Is that you?" The words hung in the air, fragile and electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. I straightened, meeting his gaze, and felt a jolt of recognition. A memory buried deep, one I hadn't touched in years. The man took a step forward, his boots echoing again each step, a drumbeat of something inevitable. The guests leaned forward, their curiosity a living thing. The string quartet lowered their bows, the melody dying mid-note. Vivian looked between us, her eyes searching for answers to a question she hadn't yet formed. Jasper's smile faltered just for a second, but it was enough. I didn't answer the man, not yet. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words settle like dust after an explosion. Something was coming. Something bigger than this moment, and I could feel it in my bones the way I'd once felt danger in the desert. I moved back to my chair, the one Jasper had taken from me. My hands, scarred and steady, gripped the wood, setting it upright with a deliberate scrape that echoed louder than it should have. I sat, my eyes locked on Vivian, offering her the smallest nod, a promise that her world hadn't shattered, not yet. But inside I felt the first crack in the life she thought she was building. The officiant cleared his throat, fumbling to restart the ceremony, but the air had changed. The music returned tentative, as if it too remembered the sound of my fall. The man at the entrance, Saul, I realized now, Jasper's father, stood frozen, his eyes still on me. His whisper had torn something open, a secret I'd buried long ago, a life I'd left behind. I didn't know what he'd say next, but I knew it would change everything. The room buzzed with unspoken questions, the guests' whispers no longer cruel, but curious, hungry for the truth. And I, Gus Reyes, sat steady in my chair, the weight of Maria's ring against my chest, ready for whatever storm was about to break. The chandelier light faded behind me as I slipped out of the Eternal Gardens hall, the echo of Jasper's words, "Your place is on the floor," still burning in my ears. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp and cold, the kind that wakes you from a dream you didn't know you were in. I walked the few blocks to my truck, my hand aching where it had struck the marble, a dull throb beneath the skin. My reflection flickered in a shop window, gray hair, tired eyes, a face carved by years of sun and struggle. But my hands, scarred and calloused, told a story no mirror could. They were honest, the hands of a man who'd built a life from nothing, who'd held a daughter through storms no one else could see. I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar creak of the old Chevy grounding me. The quiet inside was different from the silence of the wedding hall, less suffocating, more like a sanctuary. I rested my palms on the steering wheel, staring at the scars that crisscrossed my knuckles, like a map of battles fought and won. Each mark was a memory, a piece of the life I'd carved for Vivian after Maria was taken from us. The weight of that night's humiliation pressed against my chest, but so did something else, a promise, old as grief, strong as steel. I'd sworn to Maria I'd protect our daughter no matter the cost, and tonight I felt the shadow of that vow stirring, as if it knew the fight was just beginning. My mind drifted as it often does when the world grows too heavy back to the garage. Not the one I work in now, but the one from years ago when Vivian was small and the world was simpler. I could still smell the sawdust, sharp and clean the way it clung to my clothes as I sanded a piece of pine in the dim light of our old Brooklyn shed. Vivian was 6 then, all wide eyes and endless questions, her small legs dangling from a stool as she watched me work. "What's that, Daddy?" she'd ask, pointing at every wrench, every bolt, her voice bright with curiosity. I'd built her a chair that summer, not just any chair, but one made for her, small enough for her to claim as her own, painted blue with the last can of paint from the porch. She'd sit in it every afternoon, swinging her legs, handing me tools she could barely lift, asking what each hum of an engine meant. "That's the heart of the car, Princess," I'd tell her, and she'd nod solemn as a scholar as if she could hear its pulse. That chair was her throne in a world of oil and grease, a place where she belonged, where she knew she was loved. When Maria died, that chair became something more. It was where Vivian sat the night we cried together, her tiny hand gripping mine like she could hold the world steady. I can still feel the weight of her against me, her sobs quiet but fierce, her trust in me unshaken even as the ground beneath us crumbled. The memory cut through the fog of the present, sharp as a blade. Here I was, decades later, sprawled on a marble floor, not by fate or war, but by the man who claimed to love my daughter. Jasper's act wasn't just cruelty, it was a declaration, a test, to see how much I'd endure, how much Vivian would let pass. My hands tightened on the wheel, the scars stretching taut. I'd survived worse than humiliation. I'd carried men through fire, rebuilt engines from scrap, raised a daughter alone when the world told me to give up. But this was different. This was a fight for Vivian's soul, and I'd be damned if I let Jasper win. I drove home through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, the neon glow of Manhattan fading in the rear view. My neighborhood welcomed me back with its familiar rhythm. Porch lights, flickering dogs barking in distant yards, the faint smell of someone grilling late into the night. Home. I stepped inside the old clock on the mantel, ticking steadily each second, a reminder that time doesn't pause for pain. Maria's photograph sat there, her smile unchanged, her eyes steady with the kind of love that outlasts death. I touched the gold chain around my neck, feeling the warmth of her ring against my skin. I promised, I whispered, my voice rough in the silence. I'll keep her safe. The next morning I was back in the garage before dawn. Not because work called, but because it was the only place that still felt like mine. The roll-up door groaned as it always did, metal protesting before giving way. Inside, the air smelled of grease and dust, of tires stacked high and coffee left too long on the hot plate. My Harley stood in the center, half assembled, its chrome catching the slivers of light breaking through the windows. I'd been rebuilding it for years, never in a rush, telling myself I'd finish when the time was right. Today I needed its rhythm, the turn of a wrench, the wipe of a rag, the steady song of labor that had always calmed the storms in my chest. I pulled on my overalls, cracked my knuckles, and went to work. The motions were second nature, carved into my muscles from decades of fixing what was broken. But as I tightened bolts that didn't need tightening, my mind wandered to the chair I'd built for Vivian. I could still see her in it, her small frame dwarfed by the garage's chaos, her eyes bright with trust. That chair was more than wooden nails. It was a promise, a piece of me given to her, a reminder that even in a world that could be cruel, there was a place for her. Jasper's chair, the one he'd yanked away, was the opposite, a weapon, a way to strip away dignity. The contrast burned, fueling the resolve that had been simmering since the night before. I leaned back on the stool, wiping sweat from my forehead, and let my eyes drift to the wall above the workbench. A row of photographs hung there, some yellowed with age. Vivian's kindergarten portrait, her gap-toothed grin beaming. Her first bicycle training wheels I'd bolted on myself. Her high school graduation, my arm around her shoulder, her cap crooked from her excitement. And one of Maria in her wedding dress, her smile a light that hadn't dimmed even after all these years. I stared at her the longest, her voice echoing in my mind. "Gus, don't let pride make you reckless, but don't let fear make you small either." The words were a lifeline pulling me back from the edge of rage. Jasper wanted me to react, to lash out, to prove I was the simple man he mocked. But I'd learned long ago that strength isn't in the shouting. It's in the standing, in the quiet resolve that outlasts cruelty. I'd fought in wars, carried men through hell, buried a wife, and raised a daughter. Jasper's games were nothing compared to that. But they weren't nothing to Vivian. She was the one caught in his web, and I had to find a way to cut her free without breaking her heart. My phone buzzed on the workbench, snapping me out of my thoughts. A notification. Social media, something I rarely touched, but Vivian had set it up for me so I could see her posts when she traveled. This wasn't from her. It was tagged a friend of a friend. My thumb hesitated, then tapped. There it was, a photo of Jasper, grinning in a suit that cost more than my truck, his arm around Vivian, who smiled but didn't glow. The caption read, "She's perfect, sweet, trusting." And her father. "He's just a simple man." The words hit like acid, burning through the calm I'd built. Simple man. I read them again, slower, each syllable a jab. That's how he saw me, not as the man who'd raised Vivian alone, not as the veteran who'd carried brothers through fire, not as the mechanic who'd built a life bolt by bolt. To him, I was a punchline, a prop in his story of conquest. I set the phone down gently, though every instinct screamed to crush it. My breath came shallow, the tick of the garage clock louder than it should have been. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, hands clasped tight, letting the sting turn into something else. Resolve. Maria's picture caught the corner of my eye. I spoke to her, my voice rasping in the empty garage. "I promised you, Maria. I promised I'd protect her." The words were a vow renewed, a line drawn in the dust. Jasper thought he could break me, thought he could own Vivian's future. But he didn't know me. He didn't know the weight of a promise kept through decades of grief and labor. And he didn't know the shadows. I carried shadows from a past that wasn't as buried as I'd thought. That afternoon, Vivian came to the garage unannounced, as always, her heels clicking against the concrete like a metronome. "Dad, you in here?" Her voice was bright but strained, carrying the weight of last night's chaos. I stepped out from behind the Harley, wiping my hands on a rag. She stood in the doorway, still in her work clothes, hair tied back, eyes tired but glowing with that spark that always reminded me of her mother. She smiled when she saw me, but it was thin, fragile like a crack in glass. "I'm here, princess," I said, crossing the room. She hugged me, her arms tight, the faint scent of her perfume. Maria's perfume wrapping around me like a memory. "You missed more of the reception last night," she said softly, pulling back to search my face. "People noticed." I shrugged. "Crowds aren't for me." But her eyes held worry, as if she were trying to bridge the gap between the father she trusted and the man she'd seen humiliated. "You're not angry, are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I've been through worse." But she looked unconvinced, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. "He's nervous," she said almost to herself. "That's all. Jasper doesn't always know how to—" I placed my hands on her shoulders, firm but gentle. "Vivian," I said, my voice steady. Was he nervous, or was he testing us? Her eyes widened, the words landing like a stone in still water. She faltered, her lips parting, but no words coming. I didn't push. Sometimes a question is enough, a seed planted in the dark that grows when the light finds it. We stood in silence, the hum of the garage refrigerator filling the space. Then she hugged me again, tighter, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, princess. Always." When she left, the garage felt heavier, the air thicker. But I knew I'd done what I needed to. The question was planted, and it would echo in her mind just as Jasper's words echoed in mine. I sat back at the workbench, staring at my hands. They trembled not from weakness, but from the weight of what lay ahead. These hands had carried me through war, through grief, through decades of labor. Now they'd have to carry me through something harder, protecting my daughter from a man who thought respect was a currency he could buy. As dusk settled over Brooklyn, the shadows stretched long across the garage floor. I picked up the rag, wiped the grease from my hands, and set the tools in order. The old clock ticked on, relentless, counting down to a reckoning I couldn't yet see. I whispered to Maria's photograph, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "Whatever comes, I'll keep my promise." But deep down I felt it a stirring, like a memory waking from a long sleep. Saul's whisper from the night before, "Sir, is that you lingered like a ghost." There was something there. something from the past, something I'd buried in the dust of Iraq. And as I closed the garage door, the weight of that memory pressed against me heavy as the ring against my chest. Jasper wasn't just a threat to Vivian. He was a thread in a larger tapestry, one I hadn't yet unraveled. But I would. For her, I would. The marble floor beneath me was cold, its polished surface reflecting the fractured light of the chandeliers above. I stood slowly, my shoulder throbbing from the fall, but my face was a mask of calm, carved from years of enduring worse than Jasper's petty cruelty. The guests' whispers buzzed like static, their eyes darting between me sprawled moments ago, and Jasper standing smug, with the chair still in his grip. Vivian's hand trembled in mine, her breath uneven, her eyes wild with a mix of fury and shame. The string quartet's melody had dyed the bows, frozen mid-air, as if the room itself held its breath. And then the boots. They weren't the polished clicks of dress shoes, the kind you'd expect in this palace of glass and wealth. These were heavy, deliberate, carrying the weight of a world far removed from champagne and roses. The sound cut through the silence each step, a drumbeat that turned every head. I straightened my hands steady despite the ache and followed the sound to the entrance. There he stood, a man in his 60s, his hair grayed at the temples, his suit fine but slightly askew as if he'd raced across the city to be here. His shoulders were squared, his posture that of a soldier, though no insignia marked him now. His eyes swept the room, taking in the frozen tableau, Vivian's tear-streaked face, Jasper's thin smile, and me rising from the floor like a ghost from a grave. His gaze locked on mine, and his face drained of color as if he'd seen something impossible. "Sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible yet sharp enough to slice through the tension. "Is that you?" The words hung in the air, fragile and electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. I felt a jolt, a memory stirring deep in my bones, sand and smoke, the rattle of gunfire, a weight on my shoulders that wasn't my own. I knew this man, Saul Hale, Jasper's father. But the recognition went deeper, to a place I'd buried long ago, a place of blood and promises made under a burning sky. The guests leaned forward, their curiosity a living thing, their whispers shifting from cruel to reverent. Vivian's grip on my hand tightened, her eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't ready to give. Jasper's smile faltered, his fingers twitching on the chair, as if he sensed the ground shifting beneath him. I didn't speak. Not yet. Some truths need silence to gain weight, to settle into the cracks of a moment before they can shatter it. Saul took a step forward, his boots echoing again, each one, a hammer striking the anvil of the past. The room weighted the air thick with questions no one dared voice. Gus Reyes, Saul said louder now, his voice trembling with something raw gratitude. Awe, maybe fear. "Sergeant Gus Reyes." The name landed like a thunderclap, and the hall stilled completely. Gasps rippled through the crowd, forks clattering against plates, wine glasses forgotten. Vivian's breath caught her fingers, digging into my arm. Jasper staggered back, the chair slipping from his hand, its clatter, swallowed by the weight of Saul's words. I stood taller, my eyes locked on Saul's, the memory flooding back unbidden. Iraq, 2003. A night patrol gone wrong. The desert air thick with smoke and screams. An ambush. Bullets tearing through the dark, pinning us down. Saul, younger, then bleeding out, trapped behind a burning Humvee. His voice ragged and desperate, swearing he'd never forget if I got him out. I'd carried him, his weight nearly breaking me 300 yards through hell rounds, cracking past my head, my own blood mixing with his. I'd left him at the evacuation point, his hand gripping mine, his promise echoing in my ears. I hadn't seen him since. I'd buried that night, along with so many others, in a box marked past. "Ladies and gentlemen," Saul said, his voice rising steady now, commanding the room like a general at the front. He pointed at me, his hand trembling not with weakness, but with reverence. "This man saved my life. In 2003 in Iraq under fire, he risked everything to carry me out when everyone else thought I was lost. Without him, I wouldn't be here. My family wouldn't be here." His eyes flicked to Jasper, sharp and unyielding, and the room felt the shift. A reckoning was coming. The whispers grew no longer mocking but awestruck, spreading like wildfire. Guests pressed hands to their mouths, others bowed their heads, as if they just realized they were in the presence of something greater than wealth. Vivian's tears fell freely now, her face torn between pride and grief, her hand still clutching mine like a lifeline. Jasper's face was ashen, his smugness gone, replaced by a dawning horror. He opened his mouth, but no words came, his perfect world cracking under the weight of a truth he couldn't control. I stood silent, letting Saul's words flood the room. For years Jasper had called me a simple man, a mechanic, a nobody to be tolerated or pitied. For months he'd tested me, humiliated me, tried to break me. But now, under the chandelier light, with the weight of history pouring from his father's mouth, I was no longer just Gus Reyes, the man who fixed engines. I was a soldier, a survivor, a father who'd carried more than men through fire. The spotlight had shifted, and Jasper was no longer the star of this story. Saul stepped closer, his boots steady, his eyes never leaving mine. "You," he said softer now, "meant only for me. I've looked for you. For years I looked." His voice cracked, and I saw the man from that night, younger, broken, swearing he'd repay a debt that couldn't be measured. I nodded just once, acknowledging the past. We shared the bond forged in blood and survival. But I didn't speak. The room didn't need my words, it needed his. He turned to the crowd again, his voice firm. "This man is the reason I watched my son grow up. The reason I had years with my wife. And tonight—" He paused, his gaze cutting to Jasper, who flinched as if struck. "Tonight, I see my son has forgotten what honor means." The words were a blade, and Jasper felt it. He shook his head, stammering, "I didn't know, Dad. I didn't realize you didn't care to realize," Saul cut in, his voice low, but sharp, slicing through Jasper's excuses. The guests were no longer watching a wedding, they were witnessing a judgment. I felt Vivian's hand tremble, her breath uneven. She looked at me, her eyes searching for something to hold on to, and I gave her what I always had, steadiness. I squeezed her hand, my voice low. "It's okay, Princess. We're still standing." But we weren't just standing. Something had shifted, something bigger than this moment. Saul's revelation wasn't just about the past, it was a key unlocking a door I hadn't known was there. The way he looked at me, the weight in his voice, hinted at more than gratitude. There was something else, something unspoken. Something that made my skin prickle with the same instinct I'd felt in the desert when danger was near. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it would change everything. The officiant tried to salvage the moment, his voice stumbling over the script, urging the band to play. The quartet lifted their bows, but the notes were tentative, as if the music itself knew the story had changed. Guests shifted in their seats, eager to pretend nothing had happened, but their eyes betrayed them. They were watching me now, not Jasper. The man they'd laughed at was no longer a punchline. He was a hero, a shadow from a past they couldn't fathom. I moved back to my chair, the one Jasper had yanked away, and set it upright again, the scrape of wood on marble louder than it should have been. I sat, my hands folded, my gaze on Vivian. Her eyes glistened, pools of confusion and pride, but I saw something new there, certainty, or the beginning of it. She was starting to see Jasper for what he was, and me for what I'd always been. The room buzzed with whispers, but they weren't cruel anymore. They carried words like hero, soldier, father, words that felt foreign but true. Jasper tried to recover his voice, cracking as he addressed the crowd. I didn't mean any harm. It was a joke, a misunderstanding." But his words were hollow, swallowed by the truth Saul had laid bare. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for something, forgiveness, maybe, or a way to escape the hole he'd dug. I didn't give it to him. I didn't need to. The truth was doing its work, slow and unyielding, like a tide pulling back to reveal what lies beneath. Saul's hand rested on my shoulder, heavy with the weight of years. "Gus," he said, so quiet only I could hear. "There's more to this. We need to talk." His words were a spark, igniting a question I hadn't asked. What did he mean? What more could there be? The memory of that night in Iraq was vivid but incomplete. Like a photograph torn in half, I nodded, my face unreadable, but inside my mind was racing. Something was coming, a secret, a truth, a storm I couldn't yet see. The reception stumbled forward, the band playing, the guests' clappings, but the air was different now. It was charged, heavy with the weight of what had been revealed and what was still hidden. Vivian stayed close to me, her hand in mine, her silence speaking louder than words. Jasper moved through the crowd, his charm a cracked facade, his eyes avoiding his father's. And I sat steady as stone, Maria's ring warm against my chest, feeling the pull of a past I'd thought was buried. As the night wore on, I felt it a shift, like the ground moving beneath my feet. Saul's words, his presence, had opened a crack in the world I'd built, and something was seeping through. Not just gratitude, not just memory, but something darker. Something tied to Jasper, to Vivian, to the life I'd fought to protect. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I'd find out. For Vivian, for Maria, for the promise I'd made. The clock above the bar ticked on each second, a step closer to a truth that would either break us or set us free. The echo of Saul's words. This man saved my life followed me like a shadow as I drove back to Brooklyn, the city's neon lights blurring into streaks of color through the truck's windshield. My hands gripped the steering wheel, the scars on my knuckles pale under the streetlights, each one a reminder of battles fought and promises kept. The night at Eternal Gardens had cracked something open, not just in the room but in me. Saul's recognition, his cryptic promise of more to this, stirred memories. I'd buried deep memories of sand and blood and debts that lingered like ghosts. But it was Jasper's face, pale and cornered, that burned brightest in my mind. His cruelty wasn't just arrogance, it was a mask, and I was starting to see the cracks. I parked outside my house, the familiar creak of the porch steps grounding me. Inside, the old clock ticked steadily, Maria's photograph, watching from the mantel, her smile a quiet anchor. I touched the gold chain around my neck, feeling the warmth of her ring against my chest. "I'm still here, Maria," I whispered, "still fighting." But the fight was changing. Jasper wasn't just a man who'd humiliated me. He was a threat to Vivian, and the weight of Saul's words hinted at something bigger, something I couldn't yet grasp. I sat in the dark, the clock's rhythm, a countdown to a reckoning I knew was coming. The next evening, Vivian called, her voice brighter than I'd expected but threaded with strain. "Dad, Jasper wants to take us to dinner, just the three of us. He thinks it'll be good for you to get to know each other." I paused, rag in hand, grease staining my palm as I stood over the Harley in the garage. The chrome glinted under the fluorescent light, a puzzle of parts waiting to be whole. Dinner with Jasper. I knew it was a trap, but when your daughter asks, you say yes. "All right, princess," I said, "I'll be there." I pulled my navy suit from the closet, the one I'd worn to Vivian's graduation, its seams mended with care. The tie was dated but clean, and that mattered more to me than fashion. On the subway ride into Manhattan, my reflection stared back from the darkened window, gray hair-lined face, hands that didn't belong among the manicured nails and cufflinks of the city's elite. The Golden Fork, the restaurant Jasper had chosen, glowed like a cathedral of glass and gold. A doorman in white gloves opened the door with a practiced smile, and the air inside smelled of truffle and polished wood, the language of money whispering in every hushed conversation. Vivian waved from a corner booth, her smile wide but fragile, like a flame flickering in the wind. Jasper didn't stand until I was nearly at the table, his movements deliberate, like an actor playing a role. He extended his hand, limp and cold, held just long enough to avoid rudeness. "Mr. Reyes?" he said, his voice smooth as oil. "Jasper," I replied, my tone even. We sat, Vivian squeezing my hand under the table, her warmth a lifeline in this sterile world. "Dad rebuilt his motorcycle from scratch," she told Jasper, pride in her voice. He glanced at me, then at his Rolex, as if measuring the worth of such a task. "Dangerous hobby for someone your age, wouldn't you say?" he said, his smile all teeth. "Different generations, different risks." I let his words pass my face, unreadable. The waiter arrived, menus in hand, but Jasper waved him off. "Wine first. The 2009 Bordeaux bottle service." He didn't ask if we wanted wine, he declared it his control, subtle but unmistakable. Vivian guided the conversation, trying to build a bridge between two men who stood on opposite shores. But Jasper's mask slipped quickly. He leaned back, fingers steepled, studying me like a specimen. "So, Mr. Reyes, you work with your hands. That must be satisfying." His tone was patronizing, a velvet glove over a fist. "I'm a mechanic," I said simply. "I fix what's broken." "How refreshing," he replied, his smile sharp. I'm in financial services, portfolio management, high-stakes investments. A different world, I suppose. Different doesn't mean better, I said, my voice calm. Vivian's nervous laughter broke the tension, her hand squeezing mine again, pleading for patience. The meal arrived, plates arranged like art portions, so small they seemed more decoration than food. I cut into mine slowly, my focus on Jasper's words, not the taste. Your daughters told me about your neighborhood, he continued, his eyes gleaming. Brooklyn. So authentic. Very, working class. I imagine the community compensates for the limitations. What limitations? My voice was steady, though my knuckles whitened against the fork. He smiled wider. Oh, nothing specific. Just that once you experience certain standards, it's hard to appreciate simpler pleasures. Generational, I think. Vivian jumped in. Dad appreciates nice things too. Of course he does, Jasper said smoothly. Different perspectives, that's all. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto mine. Tell me, Mr. Reyes, what's your greatest achievement? The question was a trap, and I knew it. Pride would be diminished, humility mocked. I met his eyes, raising Vivian. Admirable, he nodded, but his eyes betrayed calculation. Single parenthood must have been challenging. Limited resources, I imagine. No wonder Vivian appreciates someone who can provide properly for her future. Vivian's face flushed. Jasper, please, what? He interrupted, his voice silk. I'm acknowledging your father's sacrifices. Those days are over. Vivian deserves the finer things, don't you agree, Mr. Reyes? My jaw tightened, the napkin nearly tearing in my grip. The room's chatter faded, crystal clinking softly at other tables. I believe in treating people with respect, I said, each word measured. Respect, Jasper raised an eyebrow. I thought I was being quite respectful. Some men in my position might insist on modern arrangements, but I understand the importance of letting older generations feel useful. Vivian's glass trembled in her hand. Please stop. Stop. What, darling, Jasper said, his tone dripping with charm. I'm just having an honest conversation with your father. The waiter returned, placing the check discreetly by Jasper's elbow. He opened it with exaggerated surprise, then slid it across to me. Tradition? He said softly. The bride's father pays. The number glared up, $347, more than a week's groceries. Vivian's face drained of color. Jasper, that's not necessary. Nonsense, sweetheart, he said. Your father wants to show his support, don't you, Mr. Reyes? The silence stretched taut as a wire. I reached for my wallet. Its leather worn smooth, a working man's wallet. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of dignity pressed against pride. I placed my card down. It's fine, princess. Jasper leaned back, triumphant. Excellent. The waiter returned with the receipt. I signed it carefully, each stroke a battle I refused to lose. The tip stung, but I gave it anyway. Dignity costs more than money. Thank you for dinner, Jasper said brightly, as if he'd done me a favor. I'm sure Vivian appreciates seeing her two favorite men get along. The casual cruelty of it burned, but I didn't let it show. Vivian's eyes glistened with shame and anger, but she said nothing. I stood my chair, scraping the marble, the sound echoing louder than it should. I nodded to Vivian and walked out, the night air sharp against my skin. Neon lights reflected off wet pavement, taxis honked, and Manhattan's pulse roared around me. But all I heard was Jasper's voice. Your place is on the floor. Your father pays. Simple, man. I rode the subway back to Brooklyn, my reflection in the window a reminder of who I was. Gray hair, tired eyes, hands scarred from labor. A simple man maybe, but not weak. At home the clock ticked on Maria's photograph, steady on the mantel. I touched her ring, whispering, I promised Maria. I'll protect her. 3 nights later the pounding came. Not a knock, but a fist hammering my door so hard the frame rattled. I'd just turned off the living room lamp, the house settling into its usual creaks. Visitors don't come unannounced in my neighborhood, not at this hour. My first thought was trouble. My second was Jasper. The pounding came again, and the porch light flicked on, catching a figure through the glass, expensive coat. Perfect hair, face twisted with something rawer than the charm he'd worn at dinner. I opened the door slowly, deliberately. Jasper shoved past me, the scent of cologne and city smoke trailing him. His shoes struck the hardwood like gunfire. He spun in the center of my living room, taking in the worn couch, The family photos, Maria's picture on the mantel. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sharp, louder than necessary, as if volume could mask the crack in his confidence. I closed the door quietly. "About what? Don't play dumb," he snapped. "Vivian's been different since that dinner. She's asking questions, having doubts. I know you've been poisoning her against me." I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. Poisoning her, or telling her the truth? He stopped pacing, his hands clenched. "You told her I was disrespectful, that I don't value family, that I'm some kind of monster." I told her what I observed, I said, my voice calm. "Nothing more, nothing less." His laugh was brittle. "Right. The concerned father act, very touching." He stepped closer, using his height like a weapon, but I'd seen real intimidation before. This was theater. "Here's what you're going to do," he said, pointing a manicured finger. "Tomorrow you call her, you apologize. You tell her you were wrong about me, that you overreacted." "Or what?" The question hung heavy, my voice low but steady, his face flushed, the polish cracking. "Or you'll find out what it's like to lose her permanently." The words were raw, desperate, not the threat of a confident man, but the plea of a boy facing rejection. He yanked his phone from his pocket, waving it like a blade. "One call, one text, and I tell her you're jealous, trying to break us apart. Who do you think she'll believe, her fiancé or her bitter old father?" I didn't move, but I shifted my stance just enough to let him feel the weight of a man who'd carried heavier burdens than his threats. He took half a step back, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice rising. "I've worked too hard to get here. I won't let some old mechanic ruin everything." "And what have you built?" I asked, my voice low. "Success, money. A future." I gestured to the room, the couch worn by years of stories, the table where Vivian did her homework, Maria's photo. "This is a daughter who knows she's loved. This is bedtime stories, scraped knees, college tuition paid in overtime. This is achievement." "Sentimental garbage," he snapped, but his voice wavered. "The world doesn't run on bedtime stories, old man. It runs on power, money, and knowing how to use both." "Maybe your world does," I said, stepping closer, my presence a reminder of whose house he stood in. "But Vivian comes from a different one." He was sweating now, his collar clinging to his neck. "She'll choose me," he said, more plea than fact. "When it comes down to it, she'll choose the life I can give her." "Will she?" The question landed heavier than my silence. His fists curled, his body tensing, but something held him back, maybe the way I stood. Maybe an instinct warning him he was out of his depth. "This isn't over," he said, his voice lacking conviction. He stormed to the door, then looked back. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually," I said softly, "I think I do." He slammed the door, his car roaring down the street. The house fell silent, the clocks tick, and the refrigerators hum, the only sounds. I walked to the mantel, Maria's photo, smiling back. I pulled her ring into the open, its gold warm against my palm. "Maria," I whispered. "I promised." The battle line was drawn, and I felt it, a storm gathering, not just in Jasper's threats, but in the secrets Saul had hinted at, secrets I hadn't yet uncovered. The next morning, the neighborhood woke with its usual rhythm, coffee and bread from the corner bakery, kids laughing on their way to school. I sat on the porch, coffee in hand, Jasper's words replaying. "She'll choose me." He believed respect could be bought, that love was a transaction. But he didn't know Vivian, not like I did. A neighbor stopped by, his eyes flickering with discomfort. "Heard your daughter's fiancé was bragging downtown," he said. "Said he's moving her out of Brooklyn, never coming back once they're married." Laughed like he was trading in a used car. I nodded, saying nothing, but the words sank deep. A week later at the bakery, Mrs. Rodriguez handed me my loaf, her hands trembling. "Overheard something at the cafe near Vivian's office," she whispered. "That young man said Brooklyn's a place you grow out of?" Said it with a smirk. Each whisper chipped away at the image Jasper had crafted, revealing the arrogance beneath. I worked longer hours in the garage, tinkering with the Harley, my hands needing motion to keep from curling into fists. One evening, as the sun painted the sky orange, my neighbor Tom, a Vietnam vet, joined me on the porch. He stared into his coffee, then said, "People are talking, Gus. Not good things. Word is, Jasper called Vivian an acquisition." The word stung like a slap. Acquisition. Something you buy, not someone you love. That night I sat at the kitchen table, the house creaking, the clock ticking past midnight. Acquisition. Cold calculated a business term. The next day confirmed it. I'd driven to Manhattan to pick up a part for the Harley, idling at a curb when I saw him. Jasper on the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear, his hand waving dismissively. His voice carried sharp and confident. "No, trust me," he said. "She's perfect, sweet, trusting. And her father's simple, exactly the kind of man who won't interfere. She's an acquisition, a step, that's all." My grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles white. The traffic light changed, horns blared, but I didn't move. Acquisition. He hung up, adjusted his cufflinks, and vanished into a glass tower. I pulled away, the city blurring, my heart pounding louder than the engine. Back in the garage, I grabbed a wrench, tightening bolts that didn't need it anything to keep the fury at bay. Maria's photo watched from the workbench, her eyes steady. "I promised," I whispered. "I'll keep her safe." The whispers, the confrontation. Jasper's words, they were pieces of a puzzle, and I was starting to see the shape. Saul's cryptic warning echoed in my mind. There's more to this. Whatever it was tied to Jasper, to Vivian, to a past I hadn't fully unearthed. The clock ticked on each second, pulling me closer to a truth that would either save my daughter or break us all. The garage was my refuge, its familiar smells of grease and steel a shield against the chaos Jasper had unleashed. I sat at the workbench, the Harley's chrome glinting under the fluorescent light, its half-assembled frame a mirror of my own fractured thoughts. Maria's photograph watched from the wall, her eyes steady, her smile a reminder of the promise I'd made to protect our daughter no matter the cost. The clock on the workbench ticked past midnight each second, a pulse in the quiet counting down to a reckoning I could feel in my bones. Jasper's words, acquisition simple, "Man, your place is on the floor," echoed like a taunt, but it was Vivian's face that haunted me most. Her eyes at that dinner, torn between love for me and the life she thought Jasper offered, held a question I couldn't answer for her. She had to find it herself. The neighborhood had started talking, their whispers weaving a web around Jasper's polished facade. Mrs. Rodriguez at the bakery. Tom on the porch, the kid who bagged groceries, they all carried pieces of the same story. Jasper's arrogance, his dismissal of Brooklyn, his casual cruelty. Each word was a crack in the dream Vivian had built, and I knew she was starting to hear them. But knowing and believing are different beasts, and my daughter was fighting a battle between her heart and the truth. I'd planted the seed that night in the garage, asking if Jasper was nervous or testing us, and I could feel it growing slow but relentless, like roots breaking stone. It was 2 days after Jasper's late-night visit to my house, his threats still ringing in my ears. "You'll find out what it's like to lose her permanently," when Vivian called. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but there was an edge to it, like a blade catching light. "Dad, can I come over?" she asked. "I need to talk." "Any time, Princess," I said, my heart tightening. I hung up and stood wiping my hands on a rag, the garage's hum a steady rhythm against the storm in my chest. I didn't know what she'd say, but I knew it was a turning point. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moment before thunder. She arrived an hour later, her heels clicking on the concrete as she stepped into the garage. The overhead light cast shadows across her face, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, a far cry from the polished dresses Jasper preferred, and I saw her mother in her Maria's strength, her quiet fire. She didn't hug me right away, which wasn't like her. Instead, she stood by the Harley, her fingers tracing its handlebars, as if grounding herself in something real. "Dad," she started, her voice trembling, "I've been thinking about what you said, about Jasper testing us." She looked at me, her eyes searching for something to hold on to. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself he was just stressed, that he didn't mean those things, the chair, the dinner, the way he talks about you, but... Her voice broke, and she pressed her lips together, fighting tears. I stayed quiet, letting her find her words. Sometimes silence is the only way to let truth breathe. I leaned against the workbench, my hands steady despite the ache in my chest. She paced, her shadow moving across the concrete like a restless spirit. "I saw something," she said finally, her voice low. "Yesterday at his office. I stopped by unannounced, wanted to surprise him with coffee. He was on the phone in his glass-walled office, all smiles, for whoever was on the other end. I heard him before he saw me. He said, she swallowed, her hands twisting together. He said, she's the perfect mark. Trusting, sweet, tied to nobody important. Her father's a nobody, a mechanic who won't get in the way. The words hit me like a fist, but I didn't flinch. I'd heard them before on that Manhattan sidewalk, but hearing them through Vivian's voice was a different kind of pain. Her eyes glistened not just with tears, but with fury, a spark I hadn't seen in her since she was a teenager standing up to bullies who mocked her for her thrift store clothes. I confronted him. She continued, her voice steadier now. I walked in, and his face, he froze, like he'd been caught stealing. He tried to laugh it off, said it was a client, just business talk. But I saw his eyes, Dad. He was lying, and I realized— She stopped, her breath hitching. I realized I've been lying to myself. I stepped closer, my hand resting on her shoulder, light but firm. You're seeing him for who he is, I said softly. That takes courage. She shook her head, tears spilling now. I'm so stupid. I thought he loved me. I thought he saw me not just some piece in his game. She looked up, her eyes raw. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you just say he was awful? I sighed, the weight of her question heavy. Because you wouldn't have believed me, princess. You had to see it for yourself. Love blinds us. It's supposed to. But the truth, it always finds a way. She sank onto the stool by the workbench, the one she'd sat on as a kid, her hands covering her face. I don't know who I am anymore, she whispered. I've been trying so hard to be what he wants, polished, perfect, someone who fits in his world. But I'm not that person, Dad. I'm yours. I'm Mom's. I'm Brooklyn, not Manhattan. Her words were a knife cutting through the years to the heart of who we were. I knelt before her, taking her hands, my scars rough against her soft palms. You're Vivian Reyes, I said, my voice steady. You're the girl who learned to change a tire before she could drive. The girl who cried when her mom died but never stopped smiling for the world. You're stronger than you know, and you don't need his world to prove it. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and I saw it, a flicker of the girl who'd sat in that blue chair I'd built, trusting me to make the world right. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. If I walk away, what happens? What if I'm wrong? You're not wrong, I said, my voice firm. You're waking up, and whatever happens, you're not alone. You got me. You've got Brooklyn. You've got your mom's strength in you. She nodded, wiping her eyes, but the fear lingered. I stood, giving her space, and moved to the Harley, picking up a wrench to keep my hands busy. The garage was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator a steady heartbeat. I wanted to tell her everything. Jasper's threats, the whispers, the way he'd called her an acquisition, but I held back. She was close to the truth, but she needed to cross that line herself. The next evening I met Sam at the corner bar, a dive, where the jukebox played Springsteen and the beer was cold. Sam was a Vietnam vet, a lawyer now, his eyes sharp despite the years. He'd been my friend since I moved to Brooklyn, the kind who knew your story without needing to hear it. I slid onto the stool beside him, the bar's dim light casting shadows across his lined face. Words spreading, he said, his voice low, sliding a beer my way. Jasper's not as slick as he thinks. People at his firm talk, clients too. He's been pushing risky deals, skimming where he shouldn't. Nothing solid enough for a courtroom, but enough to make folks nervous. I took a sip, the cold biting my throat. What kind of deals? Sam leaned closer, his voice dropping. Offshore accounts, shell companies. The kind of thing that smells like money laundering but looks clean on paper. He's got a reputation, charming, ruthless. Calls his fiancé a strategic asset to his partners. My grip tightened on the bottle. He said that. Sam nodded. Heard it from a guy who worked security at one of his meetings. Jasper's not just marrying Vivian for love, Gus. She's a piece of his plan, leverage maybe, or a way to look respectable. Something's off, and it's bigger than you or her. I stared into the amber liquid, my mind racing. Saul's words, "There's more to this," echoed sharper now. Jasper wasn't just a cruel man, he was a schemer, and Vivian was caught in his web. What do I do? I asked, my voice low. Sam's eyes met mine, steady as stone. You don't confront him yet. You let him think he's winning. But you talk to Vivian. She's smart. She'll see it if you guide her, not push. I nodded, the weight of his words settling in. Sam clapped my shoulder, his grip firm. You're a soldier, Gus. You've carried heavier than this. Back in the garage, I worked late. The Harley's bolts a rhythm to my thoughts. Sam's warning, Vivian's tears, Jasper's threats, they were pieces of a puzzle, and I was missing the edges. I touched Maria's ring, its warmth a lifeline. I promised, I whispered the words of vow renewed. The next day a new voice joined the chorus. Nancy, Jasper's aunt, called me out of the blue, her voice trembling through the phone. "Gus, it's Nancy Hale. I need to see you. It's about Vivian." I met her at a diner near the edge of Brooklyn, its formica tables and coffee-stained mugs a world away from Jasper's glass towers. Nancy was in her 50s, her face kind, but worn, her hands twisting a napkin as she spoke. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her eyes darting to the door. "But after the wedding, after what Saul said, I can't stay quiet. Jasper's not right, Gus. He's always been ambitious, but this marrying Vivian, it's not love. It's a strategy." I leaned forward, my voice low. "What kind of strategy?" She hesitated, then whispered, "He needs her for something, credibility maybe, or access. I overheard him talking to a man, someone dangerous. They mentioned Vivian said she was perfect for the deal. I don't know what it means, but it's not good." My blood ran cold, but I kept my face steady. "Why tell me now?" Her eyes met mine, filled with guilt. "Because Saul told me who you are, what you did for him. And because Vivian reminds me of my daughter. She deserves better." I nodded, thanking her, but my mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments. Jasper's phone calls, his deals, his aunt's warning it was a pattern, and Vivian was at its center. I drove home the city, blurring my hands tight on the wheel. The garage welcomed me back, its familiar hum, a balm against the storm in my chest. I sat at the workbench, staring at Maria's photo, her ring heavy against my skin. "I'm close, Maria," I whispered. "I'll keep her safe." That night Vivian came to the house unannounced, her face pale but resolute. She stood in the living room, her hands clasped, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Dad, I need to tell you something. I went through Jasper's emails today. I know it's wrong, but I had to know." I stood, my heart pounding. "What did you find?" Her voice trembled, but she held my gaze. "He's been lying. Not just to me, but to everyone. There are emails about deals, money moving through accounts I've never heard of, and one mentioned me. It called me a key asset for a merger. He's using me, Dad. He's using me to get something, and I don't even know what it is." She broke, then a sob escaping, and I pulled her into my arms, her tears soaking my shirt. She clung to me, her body shaking, but her voice was fierce. "I'm done. I can't marry him. I can't be with someone who makes me feel small, who makes me ashamed of who I am." I held her tighter, my voice low but steady. "You're not small, Vivian. You're my daughter. You're Maria's daughter. You're stronger than he'll ever understand." She pulled back, wiping her eyes, a new fire in her gaze. "I need to end this. But I'm scared, Dad. What if he doesn't let me go?" I cupped her face, my hands rough but gentle. "He doesn't get to decide that. You do. And I'm right here, Princess. Always." The room was quiet, the clock ticking softly, Maria's photo watching over us. Vivian nodded, her jaw set, and I saw it, the awakening, the moment she chose herself over the lie she'd been sold. But I felt it too, the shadow of Saul's warning, the weight of Jasper's schemes. This wasn't over. The truth was close, but it was dangerous, and I knew I'd have to face it to keep my promise to Maria. The morning of the wedding broke over Brooklyn with a quiet I hadn't felt in weeks, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm's final roar. I stood in the garage, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, the steam curling like a ghost in the dawn light. The Harley gleamed under the fluorescent bulb, its chrome polished to a mirror finish, a testament to years of patient labor. Maria's photograph watched from the workbench, her smile steady, her ring warm against my chest. I'd promised her I'd protect Vivian, and today that vow would be tested. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of truths uncovered and others still hidden, but I was ready. I'd faced worse than Jasper's games, deserts, gunfire, grief, and I'd come through. For Vivian, I'd do it again. The past weeks had been a crucible. Jasper's cruelty, the chair, the dinner, the threats had revealed his true face, a mask of charm hiding a schemer's heart. Vivian's awakening, her discovery of his emails and the word acquisition, had shattered the illusion she'd clung to. Sam's warnings about Jasper's shady deals and Nancy's confession about his dangerous connections had confirmed it. Jasper wasn't just a cruel man, he was a predator using Vivian as a pawn in a game I was only beginning to understand. Saul's cryptic words, "There's more to this," lingered like a shadow, hinting at a past tied to Iraq, to debts unpaid, to secrets that could change everything. Today at the wedding it would all come to light. I dressed carefully, the navy suit pressed its seams, a quiet defiance against Jasper's world of wealth. The eternal gardens loomed as I arrived, its chandeliers glittering like stars trapped in glass, the air thick with roses and anticipation. Guests filled the hall, their voices a low hum, their eyes flickering with the memory of my fall weeks ago. I felt their gazes but didn't flinch. I was Gus Reyes, mechanic, veteran father, and I carried a strength they couldn't measure. Vivian had asked me to be here not just as her father but as her anchor, and I wouldn't fail her. The ceremony began, the string quartet weaving a melody that felt too delicate for the storm brewing beneath the surface. Vivian stood at the altar, her lace gown, Maria's gown, glowing in the soft light, her face a mask of calm that didn't reach her eyes. Jasper stood beside her, his smile polished but strained, his hands restless at his sides. I sat in the front row, my hands folded, Maria's ring a steady weight against my chest. The officiant's voice droned words of love and commitment that felt hollow in the face of Jasper's lies. I watched Vivian, her shoulders tense, her gaze darting to me every few seconds, as if drawing strength from my presence. Then it came, the moment I'd known was inevitable. The officiant asked, "If anyone knows any reason why this couple should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace." The room stilled, the silence so thick it pressed against my skin. Vivian's eyes locked on mine, and I saw it, the fire I'd seen in her as a child, the spark of her mother's resolve. She stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice clear. "I do." She said the words cutting through the hall like a blade. Gasps rippled through the crowd, chairs creaking as guests leaned forward. Jasper's face froze, his smile crumbling into something raw, almost feral. "Vivian," he hissed, his voice low but sharp. "What are you doing?" She turned to him, her eyes blazing with a strength I hadn't seen in years. "I'm choosing myself," she said, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm choosing the truth. You don't love me, Jasper. You never did. I was an acquisition, a step in your plan. I read your emails, I heard your lies, and I'm done." The hall erupted in whispers, guests clutching their pearls, their faces a mix of shock and fascination. Jasper's jaw tightened, his hands clenching, but he forced a laugh, the sound brittle. "Sweetheart, you're upset. Let's talk privately." "No." She cut him off, her voice rising, carrying the weight of her awakening. "You don't get to talk your way out of this. You humiliated my father, mocked our home, our life. You called me Aki asset for your deals. You thought you could buy me, but I'm not for sale." I stood, my heart pounding, pride swelling in my chest. Vivian's words were a fire burning away the lies Jasper had built. I moved toward her, my steps steady, the crowd parting as if they felt the weight of my presence. Jasper's eyes darted to me, panic flickering beneath his charm. "Mr. Reyes," he said, his voice loud, desperate to reclaim control. "Tell her she's mistaken. This is a misunderstanding." I stopped beside Vivian, my hand resting on her shoulder, my voice low but firm. "No misunderstanding, Jasper. She sees you now. We all do." The crowd's whispers grew, a tide of judgment turning against him. Jasper's face flushed, his hands shaking as he turned to the guests. "This is absurd," he said, his voice cracking. "I've done nothing but love her. Her father's filled her head with lies, turned her against me." "Enough," a voice boomed, cutting through his words like a gunshot. Saul Hale stepped forward from the back of the hall, his boots echoing on the marble, his face a storm of anger and grief. The crowd stilled, the weight of his presence undeniable. "You will not speak of this man that way," he said, pointing at me, his voice trembling with conviction. "Gus Reyes saved my life in Iraq, carried me through hell when no one else could. And you've shamed him, shamed your fiancé, shamed our family." Jasper staggered back, his face ashen. "Dad, I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Saul said, his voice low, cutting deeper than a shout. "And there's more you don't know. He turned to me, his eyes heavy with the truth I'd sensed but hadn't grasped. Gus, I owe you more than my life. That night in Iraq you saved me, but you also carried something else, a message, a promise. I swore I'd repay you, but I failed. I didn't know Jasper was using Vivian until Nancy told me. The room spun, the pieces falling into place. Saul's cryptic warning, "There's more to this," wasn't just about gratitude. I stepped closer, my voice low. "What message, Saul?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine, then spoke softly, for me alone. "You carried a list that night, names of men tied to a deal Jasper's been chasing for years. He found out years later that you were there, that you might know something. Marrying Vivian wasn't just about status. It was about control, about keeping you close, making sure you didn't talk." The revelation hit like a shockwave, memories of that night in Iraq. Flooding back sand smoke, a crumpled paper I'd handed to a medic thinking it was nothing. Jasper's schemes, his deals, his cruelty, it was all tied to a past I'd buried, a past he feared I might unearth. I looked at Vivian, her face pale but resolute, and knew she'd heard enough to understand. "Vivian," Jasper pleaded, his voice desperate now, "this is nonsense. I love you. You know I do." She shook her head, her hand steady as she reached for the engagement ring on her finger. The crowd held its breath as she slid it off the diamond, catching the chandelier light like a dying star. She held it out, her voice clear. "This isn't love. This is a lie. I choose my family, my home, my truth. I choose me." She dropped the ring into his hand, the clink echoing in the silence. Jasper stared at it, his face a mask of disbelief, his world crumbling. The guests murmured, some standing, others whispering furiously, the tide of their judgment now a flood. Vivian turned to me, her eyes glistening but strong, and took my arm. "Let's go, Dad." We walked down the aisle together, not as bride and father, but as daughter and father, her steps sure, mine steady. The crowd parted, their faces a blur of awe and respect. Saul followed us, his boots a quiet echo, his presence a shield against the chaos we left behind. Jasper's voice called after us, a weak protest swallowed by the hall's roar, but we didn't look back. Outside, the night air was cool, the stars bright above Brooklyn's skyline. Vivian stopped, her breath visible in the chill, her hand still in mine. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, "for not seeing it sooner." I pulled her close, my arms strong around her. "You saw it when it mattered, Princess. That's enough." She smiled, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen since she was a girl in that blue chair I'd built. "I want to go home," she said, her voice soft but certain. We drove back to Brooklyn, the city's lights fading into the familiar glow of our neighborhood. The house welcomed us, its creaks and shadows a comfort, after the cold grandeur of the wedding hall. Vivian sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, the steam curling like a promise of peace. I stood by the mantel, Maria's photograph, watching her ring warm against my chest. "Dad," Vivian said, her voice quiet. "What was Saul talking about, that list, the deal? What does it mean?" I sighed, the weight of the past settling over me. "Something from the war," I said. "A piece of paper I carried out of a firefight, names I didn't understand at the time. I thought it was nothing, but it must have been important enough for Jasper to fear it, to want to control us." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Will you find out if it matters?" "I will," I said. "But tonight, it's enough that you're here." She smiled, her shoulders relaxing, the tension of weeks melting away. We sat in silence, the clock ticking softly, the house wrapping us in its warmth. Outside, Brooklyn hummed, kids laughing, a dog barking, the faint strum of a guitar from a neighbor's porch. This was home, not Jasper's world of glass and lies, but a place built on love and truth. Later, as Vivian slept in her old room, I stepped onto the porch, the night air cool against my skin. I pulled Maria's ring from its chain, holding it to the moonlight, its gold glowing softly. "I kept my promise," I whispered. The stars blinked above, and I felt her presence, not as a ghost, but as a warmth, a strength that had carried me through. Vivian was safe, not just from Jasper, but from the doubts that had threatened to break her. And I was whole, not because I'd won a fight, but because I'd stood steady, letting the truth do its work. The next morning I walked to the garage, the Harley waiting like an old friend. I picked up a wrench, the familiar weight grounding me, and started working. The engine hummed to life, a low rumble that echoed the strength I'd found in myself, in Vivian, in the life we'd built. Jasper was gone, his schemes unraveling, his name whispered now, not with admiration, but with scorn. Saul had promised to handle him to uncover the truth of that list, but that was a battle for another day. For now I had my daughter, my home, my promise kept. The road stretched ahead, not smooth but steady, and I knew we'd walk it together. The garage door creaked open, sunlight spilling across the concrete, and I smiled. This was enough.